And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Hello all, I'm National Weather Service Meteorologist Peter Chan with your Alaska Marine Weather Outlook on this Friday, April 19th. And this outlook is for the weekend, for Saturday and Sunday. But we do start with the sea ice on this Friday afternoon, and we find still ice here within Kuskokwim Bay around Nunavik Island, extending back towards St. Matthew. And there has been a little bit of an advancement southward as a result of the northerly component to the winds here across this portion of the eastern and central Bering Sea. Meanwhile, though, we will develop more, I think, of an offshore flow as we go through the weekend. And overall, a little advancement may occur, but we're so late now in the season, we're not looking at any new ice development, simply too mild for that. But looking at area of low pressure that's going to be located later tonight, early Saturday morning. This is a system that's bringing windy conditions to the Pribilov Islands, along with some blowing snow, wet snow. And this system will continue to kind of just back toward the west. The stationary front responsible for the plume of moisture coming in off the North Pacific into the Western Gulf, especially at Kodiak Island and the entrance of Cook Inlet. There has been just over 7 inches of rain in 3 days fallen in Kodiak City, resulting in minor flooding and even a couple of minor landslides. The threat of flooding and minor landslides will continue tonight into at least Saturday morning before conditions begin to improve as this feed of moisture starts to break down. Also, the ridge of high pressure over northwest Canada will begin to break down as well this weekend. So areas that have enjoyed clear skies and very warm daytime temperatures. We've seen highs in the lower 60s at Fairbanks, Eagle, Northway, down here through the Panhandle, even as warm as the mid and upper 60s at places like Sitka and Klawak. So one more warm, sunny day coming up for these areas on Saturday, though some clouds will start to increase, maybe a few light showers working in by Sunday. This collection of weaker low pressures don't have much in the way of wind around them as they extend in the North Pacific just south of the Gulf and then back into the Bering. This system, there's some energy dropping down out of the eastern portion of Russia. In the mid-level shortwave trough and energy will merge up with a low coming out of the North Pacific. And all that's going to get together over the western Aleutians and in through this lower portion of the Bering Sea as we go through the weekend. And it will have wind and precipitation around it, gale and some storm force winds certainly likely with that feature. That is where the most notable weather action will be. Meanwhile, the high pressure ridge that was over northwest Canada, then nudging into the central interior, will start to really break down and be less of a factor as we get into Sunday and early next week. But otherwise, relatively quiet weather will continue through a good portion of the mainland here for Sunday, though a few lingering light showers could still occur there down there at the entrance of Cook Inlet along parts of the eastern Kenai, northern Kodiak Island, with a few showers working their way up into the Panhandle. So wind and waves Saturday, nearshore forecast, north-northwest winds, 10 knots here, Stevens Passage on up through Lynn Canal, waves foot or two. For areas further south, look for south winds 10 knots, Dixon entrance, waves a couple of feet. Offshore flow 10 to 15 knots, swells generally 78 feet in the nearshore waters within 15 nautical miles of the Gulf Coast shoreline there of the Panhandle. And then on Sunday, wind should turn more southerly throughout the inner channel, south 10 to 15 knots, waves 2-3 feet at most. For areas along the Gulf Coast, we expect winds to be generally out of the west-southwest 10 to 15 knots and swells just right around 5 feet. So for Saturday, winds are going to come down here at the entrance of Cook Inlet, Kennedy entrance there, 25 to 30 knots, swells 9-10 feet. Northeast winds to 10 knots, Prince William Sound, waves there a couple of feet. 20 to 25 knot northeasterly winds with waves of 5 to 7 feet there in middle and upper Cook Inlet. And for Sunday, look for winds to come down further, generally variable winds around 10 knots outside of Hinchinbrook entrance. East winds to 10 knots, Prince William Sound, 2-foot waves, and then northeast winds 15 to 20 knots, upper lower Cook Inlet, 3 to 4 foot waves, easterly winds to 20 knots there, lower Cook Inlet and at the entrance, with waves of 5 to 6 feet. Winds across Kodiak Island on Saturday, still northeasterly 20 knots within Shelikof Strait, variable to the east of the island. And then as we go down along the Alaska Peninsula, winds northeast becoming variable, but only around 10 knots. Swells 3 to 5 feet on the North Pacific side and only 1 to 3 feet on the Bering side. Come Sunday, we'll see winds relax further around Kodiak Island, variable 10 knots within Shelikof Strait. South winds on the east side of Kodiak Island to 15 knots, and then 10 to 15 knot winds and often variable on the North Pacific side in areas north of Cold Bay, and waves pretty minor, 2 to maybe 4 foot swells on the North Pacific side and only running around a couple of feet there on the Bering side. Winds coming down at least temporarily in the Aleutians before the next system. Saturday, look for north-northwest winds, eastern central Aleutians at 20 knots, becoming variable off to the west, anywhere from 10 to as much as 20 knots there west of Kiska and Shimia. But as the next low starts to get organized on Sunday, we expect southwest winds 15 and then picking up to 25, 30 knots south to southeast winds back through Adak westward to Kiska, and northwest winds to 20 knots, 25 knots there west of Kiska as that area of low pressure kind of starts to wrap up. So they'll likely increase by the time we get into Monday. For the southwest coast, so we're having more of offshore flow now. Saturday, northeast winds 15 knots out of Norton Sound. Northeast to east winds 20 knots off of the Yukon Delta, 20 knots out of Kuskokwim Bay. Northeast winds 10 knots out of Bristol Bay. 25 knot winds out of the northeast to St. Matthew, and northwest winds at 20 knots there in the Pribilofs with waves running 4 or 5 feet. For Sunday, look for variable winds within Bristol Bay and around the Pribilofs at just 10 knots. But as we go up along the coast, northeast winds out of Norton Sound at 15 knots, turning northerly along the lower Yukon coastline with the ice in place. Easterly winds, though, as high as 25 knots there in the vicinity of St. Matthew. And along the Arctic coast, 35 knot northerly gales, one of the reasons we have the winter weather advisory for the northern and western shorelines here of the Seward Peninsula, including Shishmaref and Wales, Port Clarence. Blowing snow, winds could gust as high as 55 miles an hour, 35 knot northerly winds veering or going back to the northeast on the north side of St. Lawrence. Going up the Chukchi Sea, winds turn to the west 15 knots and continue that way, 15 to 20 knots along the Arctic coast to Kaktovik. And by Sunday, we still see westerly winds 15 knots along the Arctic coast, Utqiagvik through Kaktovik. And then as we drop down along the Chukchi Sea, through the lower Chukchi Sea, winds accelerate 25 to 35 knots there prior to passing through the Bering Strait. South of the Bering Strait, we could see gales of 35 to 40 knots, especially north and west side of the Seward Peninsula, along with blowing snow. And that would also be the case potentially there along the north side of St. Lawrence Island.